Hello, and welcome to More Intelligent Tomorrow, a wide-ranging exploration of the potential impact of AI on the world around us, as envisioned by the future heroes of the human and machine intelligence revolution. What does falling in love and Formula One have in common? We'll discuss this and more with Dr. Hannah Fry on today's episode. And now, your host, Ben Taylor.
Dr. Hannah Fry, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I actually read your book this morning, The Mathematics of Love on Audible. And it has really high reviews, by the way. I imagine you already knew that.
Try not to check it too often, but yes, I did know.
What a fun book. So isn't researching love a bit of a taboo topic from an academic perspective? Did you get any pushback from your peers where they thought, really? You're going to research the mathematics behind love?
It wasn't supposed to be totally serious. This is actually about the same time as all of this stuff is going on. This is the TED Talk that I gave, The Mathematics of Love. I never intended for it to go quite as far as it did. It was kind of like a private joke that got very out of hand. It was more like applied all of these tactics to my own relationships and designed my wedding using all these mathematical tricks and stuff. So it was quite tongue-in-cheek, really. It was never meant to be very serious academic work. And in terms of the pushback from my colleagues, I don't know. I'm quite good at not listening to them. I'm sure some people raised an eyebrow when I wasn't looking.
Well, I think the book does a lot of good for a few different reasons. And one of those reasons is math has such a bad reputation for being very boring. It's one of the most hated subjects of all the subjects from students. And I feel like your book is a step in the right direction, along with the other talks you've given, to make math more enjoyable, more relatable, more exciting.
It's a funny thing, actually, because, okay, so first off, it's not universal, so I know that in the States and the same in the UK and in lots of places around Europe, people really hate doing math at school. They hate it. It affects them so much. Like whenever you meet adults and you tell them you're a mathematician, it's like the first thing they want to tell you is how much they hated the subject at school. Across the world, that's not always true. So in Singapore in particular, if I showed you a page of a brand new language that you've never seen before, of course you wouldn't understand it. Of course it wouldn't make any sense. You have to decode it and understand it before you can play around with it. And they have the same attitude to a page of maths. I think in the UK, certainly, you show people a page of maths and they have sort of a phobia about it. It's like this kind of physical reaction to seeing a page of maths they haven't seen before. I'd like to sort of pretend that I have this really noble quest to make people love maths as much as possible. But more than that, I know all of these stories and I know all of these totally mind-blowing, insightful ways to look at the world that no one else is really talking about. If you've got all of those in your pocket, why wouldn't you share them? It's much more like that than necessarily that I'm on this crusade to change maths education.
So it sounds like it's more personal, more maybe a little bit more selfish, where these are really interesting to you, and it turns out they're really interesting to other people.
Yeah, because they are really interesting.
So a thought I had when I was reading your book this morning, you mentioned the alien comparison on the statistics. I have a wonderful niece. She just turned 18. And I was thinking of her when I was reading your book that I don't want her to get married right away. She doesn't have to follow the rule perfectly, but at least go out and date a lot of people, figure out what you like, and then get married, which is a little hypocritical because I eloped when I was 20.
Did you?
Yeah. So mathematically, what are the chances of my marriage being great? It turns out we have one of the better marriages out of our network, but statistically, the odds were terrible.
Well, maybe not terrible. You have to remember that this whole idea, this optimal stopping theory, which is the thing that you're describing, it's this idea that you play the field for a little while, and then once you've got a sense of what's out there, you pick the next person that comes along that's better than everyone you've seen before. And you have to remember that your chances of success, even if you follow that strategy, are still only 37%. So, the chances of you having missed someone brilliant in that time when you were playing the field and deciding not to take anyone seriously, they're actually pretty high. I certainly wouldn't make any serious life choices like that based on the maths alone.
Yeah.
One thing to say though is that I think a lot of the evidence about long-term happiness in relationships, in long-term relationships, is it's about the attitude towards the commitment. So, for example, there are some studies that look at arranged marriages. So where the couple have very limited opportunity before marrying to, you know, suss each other out, to like work out if they're compatible. And actually, happiness in arranged marriages, it's sort of really extraordinary, right? Like, I mean, it regularly beats those of more traditional style, you know, dating and then falling in love afterwards. And there is this idea that actually, that if you're both totally committed to making it work and are willing, therefore, to be just much more able to compromise, then actually that can have a really positive impact. So, you know, maybe sometimes too much choice is a bad thing.
I want to make sure we capture the Hannah Fry story. So, going way back in time, when did you decide to pursue math?
Yeah, it's not so much that I ever actively made this choice to be a mathematician. It's more like at every possible stage, I decided I wasn't quite done with it, which means inevitably you practice more, which means actually it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You just end up getting better and better and better. So that really, I think, was a kind of tidal wave of success that I just rode for a really long time. But really what I wanted to do, I wanted to work in Formula One. I wanted to work in racing. And I got there, I succeeded. So after my PhD, I got into Formula One. I was working as an aerodynamicist. And I was like, finally, this dream, I've achieved it. And it was the worst job of all time ever. And I hated it. And I barely lasted any time at all. And I was like, I'm going straight back to maths.
Okay. Well, I just had a quick thought while you were saying that. It might not be too late for you to include Formula One into your mathematical journey, because the math behind Formula One is mind-blowing. So,
I know. I know.
One quick fact, they create more downforce than the weight, which means they could drive upside down in a tunnel.
I know.
So
good.
So is this going to be a TED Talk we can look forward to? Or some presentation online where you just tear apart the mathematics behind Formula One?
I mean, so that is to be honest, that is the real reason why I love it so much, is that, I mean, what goes on track is like, it's kind of interesting and whatever. You know, when people are like, oh, it's really boring, then nothing happens. It's like, no, you're wrong. What you're watching is essentially a gigantic mathematical competition. It's what goes on behind the scenes, off the track. That's the stuff that's so exciting. So, look, can I give you just one tiny example?
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
I love it. Okay, so someone worked out that what you can do is, if you shine a laser onto an object in a room where someone's speaking, let's say a crisp packet, for example, while someone's speaking, the air around them is vibrating, right? And if you have a very high precision laser and a high speed lens pointing at that same crisp packet, you can pick up on those tiny vibrations and then decode them later to reconstruct the sound of what someone was saying, right? So there's an amazing video of this on YouTube you can find, where I think someone's singing like Mary Had a Little Lamb, and the crisp packet is moving there. They reconstruct the voice. Anyway, so it was used in Formula One you'd go up to the motorhomes, you'd go outside like Ferrari's motorhome, and you'd shine a little laser in to like a plant leaf or something inside, have your camera there. I mean, there's cameras everywhere, so, you know, not going to be that suspicious. And then you'd go back and you'd work out like what tactics they were going to use, all of this stuff. I mean, it's just Fourier analysis, right? It's brilliant. Anyway, so now the motorhomes in Formula One, to get around this, are triple glazed, so that the diffraction of the light and the laser is such that you can't do it anymore. It's amazing.
So, Hannah, as we think about this world of AI and humans working together, let's talk about what we're good at and what we're bad at. So maybe starting with humans. What are humans great at? What are we bad at?
Well, I think that we're really good at understanding context and understanding nuance. I think, there's our sort of situational awareness, I think, is really sophisticated, much more sophisticated than machines have yet managed to replicate. But then on the other hand, I think that being consistent or, unbiased, or performing well under pressure, or we're just a mess, really. I think, like, on the other hand, there's a lot that humans are very, very bad at. And I think that actually when you're talking about designing machines or designing AI or designing anything that interacts with humanity, I think it's so important to think about that boundary. The story that I always think of with precisely this point, it's like the classic old story about AI that everyone always talks about, which is Deep Blue, the Kasparov story, right? And everyone's always like, isn't it great that the machine beat Kasparov? That for me is not the interesting thing about that story. The interesting thing about that story is that I think ultimately this was a story about machines coming up against human fallibility. The thing you have to bear in mind about Kasparov is that, the man was like a tornado, right? I spoke to one grandmaster and that's how they described him. They said that when he walked into a room, everybody was like pinned to the wall because he was so powerful and everyone was just in awe of him. And he used to use all of these, like, he just was so intimidating to play against. So apparently he had this watch on his wrist, and he would kind of sit there and play chess. And then he would take his wristwatch off and place it on the chessboard next to him. Place it next to the chessboard. And when the game had kind of got to a certain stage, when he decided that the game was over, right? Not when the game was over, when he decided that the game was over, he would pick up this wristwatch, put it back on his wrist, and that was essentially his way of signaling to his opponents that he was done playing with them, that it was time for them to resign the game. Imagine how intimidating that would be to play against. But the thing is that for starters, none of those tactics worked on the machine, right? Humans versus machines, it's just like none of that stuff worked at all. But the key thing is that actually the opposite tactics could then be played on Kasparov himself. So IBM, when they coded up this machine, they knew that Kasparov would be trying to second guess what the machine was doing. So they knew that he'd be like he knew that he'd be thinking about the computational time for each of the moves. So they deliberately coded this machine so that when it finished a computation, sometimes it would just play straight away. But then there were other times where it would just pause for a random amount of time before coming up with the answer, which would mean that sometimes there would be some very simple positions in which to Kasparov, it would appear as though the machine was taking a really long time to work it out. So he's then sitting there thinking, well, what is the machine thinking? And so on and so on. Anyway, I think pretty much everybody in the chess world is in complete agreement that at that point in time, Kasparov was still a much better chess player than the machine. But this whole effect just psyched him out, and he just lost his, he basically lost his cool. He just couldn't, he didn't know how to play against something, that his normal tactics of intimidation didn't work, and he was being intimidated in return. And so, of course, the rest is history. Kasparov says lots of this stuff himself in his book. But I think that whenever you talk about this idea of humans versus machines, I think that really honing in on this interface, if you like, between human flaws and machine strengths, and vice versa, machine flaws and human strengths. I think just that whole area is just incredibly interesting and incredibly important to consider when you are designing this stuff to go out in the world.
So it sounds like design it with the spirit of maximum usefulness around our faults. Attention, making sure a physician doesn't miss some detail, but including them in the loop. Do you think this balance will shift in the computer's favor? When you think of the faults of machines, will they be improved over time to begin to match humans?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I certainly think that there are some areas when inevitably the machines are going to improve and we'll be able to automate them further. But I also think that some of this stuff is really complicated in how you ultimately want the balance to be. I think that pathology is a really good example of this. So let's imagine that we could get a machine tomorrow that was perfectly able to, let's even say to sort of 100% accuracy, if you like, to recognize cancerous cells within the body. So cancer it's not really this binary thing. So if I take breast cancer, for example, for starters, breast cancer isn't this binary thing. It's not like You either don't have it or you have it. It's like actually exists on a spectrum between perfectly normal tissue and really nasty metastatic cancer. At the moment, the AI is designed to say normal and abnormal, and then the pathologist comes in and puts the diagnosis on top of that. But let's even say, right, like let's kind of live in a fantasy world where far in the future, the machine is capable of categorizing each one of those along the spectrum. There's like another problem to that, which is that actually a lot of cancer in your body ends up not being anything you need to worry about. A lot of cancer in the body is actually dealt with by the body or just lies there dormant for the whole of your life and really isn't anything to be concerned about. So we know this because there have been studies which have looked at dead bodies, essentially. There was one study in Denmark in the 70s where they took something like 80 deceased women, and they performed a double mastectomy on each of these women. And of the group, none of them had any record of cancer, right? This particular group of women, none of them had any record of cancer. They died of things like heart attacks or car crashes, that kind of thing. But when they performed these double mastectomies after death, they found that a quarter of these women had cancerous cells within their tissue. And that's like an extraordinary finding that maybe up to, and this has been replicated a number of times, right? That maybe up to a quarter of us, certainly a quarter of women, are wandering around with what is essentially, if it was found, breast cancer, but just not anything that would ever develop into anything that we needed to be concerned about. So the problem, if you suddenly come up with this algorithm that is perfectly capable of diagnosing, of finding every single cancerous cell in the entire world, right? Let's imagine that. It's still not a great thing because ultimately it would mean that you would have millions of women, for instance, who would end up having unnecessary cancer treatments. So I think that there is... it kind of goes back to what I was saying about like how with humans, it's all about context and nuance and all of that. And I think that actually there are some things where if you just switch over to an automated decision, actually you can end up in some ways doing more damage than good.
Because of human emotions.
Well, I think that's certainly part of it. Let's say you have an algorithm that is better at predicting the future than a human is. We still hold our algorithms to higher standards than we hold our humans. I think that we, in some ways, understand that humans are fallible and can forgive a mistake in a human in a much easier way than we can within an AI. I mean, driverless cars is the perfect example of that, right? Like, how many people are killed on the road all the time at human hands, and we're sort of shrug our shoulders a little bit and say it's a real tragedy. But if there was one car that made a mistake that caused a loss of human life, everyone's very angry.
Well, every time someone gets decapitated by a Tesla, it's in the news, but they're already winning on the numbers. So if you look at the number of people that would have died had they been driving themselves, they're already winning.
Yeah.
An important question I want to ask you is, we're both fans of AI. We see a lot of use, a lot of value. And with COVID, I read a blog post a couple of weeks ago where they essentially is a really harsh criticism where they said COVID has been a massive failure of mathematics, AI, and science. And so when you think of SIR models and just the joke of like, this is what it's going to do, and these are our these are our boundaries, or even the debate about should you wear a mask, has science failed us with COVID, or is this the emotional side of humans getting involved in science?
I think certainly AI wasn't straight out the blocks, but I think more and more now we're starting to see it come into play. There was a really lovely example of it the other day of a test, a COVID test that is based on machine learning, having recognised the signatures of, I think they shine light on the particles, and then the machine reads the light, and then works out whether it's COVID or not based on a trained data set. So I think that, okay, it's certainly true that AI was, slower to get going. But it sounds like, though, the blog post you're talking about is saying that maths in general, as in like epidemiological models, have failed us. Is that what it was saying?
it was saying that, but they also said essentially science has failed us. I think they're throwing in the mask debate, like something very so simple. Why have the SIR models maybe not been robust enough? What are some of the main issues with SIR models where they're not able to model COVID very well compared to other pandemics or epidemics?
For starters, I think I would strongly disagree that the SIR models have been wrong. And in the UK, there was one particularly very famous paper that was published by an epidemiologist called Neil Ferguson, which said that there would be something like 500,000 deaths in the UK, and it would be an absolute disaster, and so on and so on and so on. And that was the reason why we needed to act. And now lots of people point back to this paper and say, well, see, 500,000 people didn't die. And it's like, no, because we acted. Right?
Yeah.
We are now on a different trajectory to what that model was projecting. So that's part of the problem. The other big problem, though, I think, is that I think people have a fundamental misunderstanding of what these models are for, because these are not forecasts like the weather, right? They're not predicting how many, exactly how many people are going to turn up to hospital on day 22, right? That's not the idea. These are trajectories, not forecasts. And I think that there is just this habit of either thinking that mathematical models are, on the one extreme, supposed to be this absolute perfect crystal ball that allows you to peer into the future and have precise understanding of exactly what's going to happen, which they're not. They're never going to work like that. Or at the other end of the spectrum, where people think that they're just complete junk and basically educated guesswork. And I don't think they're that either. I think they sit in the middle. And I think that when you are driving blind, as we certainly were in March, I think that these are the only thing you have. These numbers are the only way that you can see ahead into the future.
Well, SIR models have been really good in the past for modeling Ebola and some of these other outbreaks. Do you think one of the main issues with COVID is we have a big issue with a lot of people being asymptomatic? That we have people that have the disease and we can't actually measure them. It's very difficult.
I totally agree with you about the asymptomatic aspect. There was one paper that was doing the rounds in about February, where it's actually quite an old paper, but I just saw it a number of times, where you essentially have on one axis, you have the percentage of people who are infected by people who do not have symptoms. So either asymptomatic people or pre-symptomatic people. And on the other axis, you have the reproduction number. So how many people one person goes on to infect. And on this graph, it's like a very famous graph, you've got these splodges of different diseases. So on the one side, on the left-hand side, you've got things like smallpox, MERS, SARS, I think is there as well, where these are incredibly infectious and very, very deadly diseases. But they are diseases where almost everybody who is infected by an individual who's showing symptoms. And that makes these diseases just very easy to isolate, to say, okay, you've got the illness, put you in this situation, lock you away, maybe not quite that cruelly, but, isolate you from everybody. And it's much easier to stop them. And then at the other end of this graph, you've got diseases like flu, you've got diseases like HIV, where, particularly in HIV, the vast majority of infection happens from people who are not showing any symptoms, who maybe even don't even know that they are that they're capable of spreading the virus. And really, back in February, this was this big conversation of like, on this graph, where does SARS-CoV-2, where does it fit on this particular graph? The real irony of this disease, in terms of its position on that graph, in terms of how far it's spread and how dramatic it's been, the real irony of this is that it isn't so much that this disease spread so quickly, it's the fact that people don't feel sick is what makes it so deadly.
Yeah.
I think is the real thing about this virus that's made it so slippery and so difficult to control.
So I don't want to end on a low note, because math is amazing and math is awesome. So what are you the most excited about in the future? So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, what does the more intelligent tomorrow look like for you? What technologies are you excited about?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so I'm actually not going to pick a maths one.
Okay.
Well, maybe I sort of am in a way. I sort of am a big believer that actually, when you look deep enough, the mathematics is there everywhere. I think that none of the modern technology that we have now would exist without that mathematical underpinning. So I'm not picking a maths one, but I sort of am in a way too. I was talking to someone the other day who has invented, who has a glove, right? Where originally it was designed so that, let's say that your hand had been injured somehow, and you needed to do certain exercises so to help with your recovery. So the idea is that a physio could put this glove on their hand, record the exercises, and then you get the glove, and then you're like, okay, I've got it. Right, here we go. So that's all fine. Nice application. But now imagine that instead of using it for physio, now imagine that you put this glove on someone who is a grade 8 pianist. And then they go off to a piano and kind of do an amazing bit of music. And then you put the gloves on someone who can't play the piano, i.e. me, and I get to sit in front of the piano and just and suddenly play, go home, play Claire de Lune, right? I mean, that's, something I can do. There's a really incredible place you can go with this stuff, because what if one day you needed to do something to your car, right? Like you needed to perhaps do an oil change in your car or whatever, right? And you just don't quite understand how the stuff works, but you've got your gloves. So you go onto a database and you download the particular thing on your database. You go out to your car with these gloves on, and then suddenly you can, perform this an oil change or something. I mean, I worked in Formula One. I don't know that much about engines. Can you tell? On your car. But I mean, this idea, right, of like rolling pastry, or I don't know, doing a plait in your daughter's hair, or all of these things. I think that we've had, the sort of internet of knowledge, if you like. We've had the internet of things, and I think that the next step really is the internet of skills, and I think that's something that I'm very much looking forward to.
I want to be conscious of your time. Thank you so much. I've had a blast talking to you, and I'm really excited to get this episode out. So thank you so much, Hannah. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Really lovely talking to you. Thank you.